Religion has profoundly influenced the sweeping American narrative, perhaps more than any other force in our history, from the time of the indigenous peoples to the present day. The National Museum of American Religion tells the surprising and compelling story of what religion has done to America and what America has done to religion, including the establishment of the revolutionary and indispensable idea of religious freedom as a governing principle in the U.S., inviting all to explore the role of religion in shaping the social, political, economic, and cultural lives of Americans, and thus America itself. Join us for Season 3 of our podcast series, Religion in the American Experience, as we follow scholars and others deep into America's religious history and learn how it can inform and animate us as citizens grappling with complex questions of governance and American purpose in the 21st century. Episodes will be released monthly on Apple Podcast, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts.
Listeners, welcome to another episode of Religion in the American Experience, a podcast of the Digital First National Museum of American Religion. Follow us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon, or wherever you get your listening fix. Lodged firmly in the American psyche and a bedrock part of American history is the Great Depression. Beginning with the stock market crash in October of 1929 and lasting a decade, it was the worst calamity to hit the United States since the Civil War. Unemployment soared, farms went under, long bread lines formed, people up and left their homes for a better place, and poverty skyrocketed. The emotional toll on millions was just as severe. For us, the question is, in what ways did religion, one of the most powerful and most ubiquitous forces in American history, react to the Great Depression? Understanding this will help all of us better comprehend religion's role generally in the American project, equipping us to better perpetuate it and perfect it into the 21st century. As part of our multi-episode series about religion in the Great Depression, Dr. Allison Green is here to help us understand how the Depression and the New Deal changed the Southern Protestant establishment in the Mississippi Delta region. It is a fascinating story. Dr. Allison Collis Green is Associate Professor of American Religious History at Candler School of Theology at Emory University and is an affiliated faculty member in the Department of History at Emory College of Arts and Sciences. She teaches United States religious history with interests in American religions as they relate to politics, wealth and poverty, race and ethnicity, the environment, and the modern rural South. She is author of No Depression in Heaven, The Great Depression, The New Deal, and the Transformation of Religion in the Delta, as well as a number of essays and articles on modern United States religious history in both scholarly and popular outlets. Dr. Green is also on the editorial board of the Journal of Southern Religion. Allison, thank you so much for being with us today.
Yeah, happy to be here. Thanks for talking to me.
First, Allison, can you tell our listeners how you became interested in religion's role during the Great Depression, including specifically in the Delta region, and please give our listeners a sense of this geographic place?
Yeah, sure. I guess I have always been interested in the relationship between religion and suffering, and especially between Christianity in the U.S. and poverty, and the kind of suffering that comes out of poverty. So this book, No Depression in Heaven, was initially my PhD dissertation at Yale, although the book is pretty different from what I wrote in grad school. And as I asked questions about religion and suffering and Christianity and politics and poverty, I kept reading books about the Depression. I read The Grapes of Wrath the same day that I read a book by Liz Cohen called Making a New Deal, which is about labor and the New Deal, and also the role of religious and ethnic societies in caring for people before the New Deal, and the way they fell apart in the Depression. So the Depression is one of the most traumatic events in the 20th century in the U.S. It changed the way that Americans thought about poverty for a really long time, and it changed the way they experienced poverty. And so I thought it surely must have also changed the way people thought about and experienced religion too. And that wasn't a question people had asked quite as much as those about wealth. So as I started to think about these questions about religion and the Great Depression, it became clear really quickly that the Great Depression was a local experience, that writing a national story about religion and the Great Depression would mean I was only writing about elite people, and those aren't the people who I was interested in. I wanted to think about the way that the experience of poverty and the experience of religion intersected in those years. And it didn't take long. I'm a historian of the South. I was interested in questions of race, and I wanted to think about questions of race, poverty, and religion, both in the urban and the rural South. And Memphis and the Delta are one of the most interconnected urban-rural regions. They really operate as a single economic unit. So that made them especially interesting. And it's also an interesting region because of its labor history, because of the Delta's relative to the rest of the South, the Delta's relative newness in its development of a plantation aristocracy and an enslaving society, and then the sort of enormous, the massive volume of that in the antebellum era. And then Memphis and the Delta was probably the economic region in the South earliest and most profoundly affected by the Great Depression. And it was also probably the region least equipped to handle it because there were no public forms of support to speak of in that region on the eve of the Great Depression. So it was a place where it was pretty clear some sort of dramatic story might be there to unfold.
And indeed, it is a dramatic story. The geographic region, when you say the Delta, this is Memphis, Tennessee, a little bit west and then south to the Gulf.
Yeah, let me describe the region as you asked. So Memphis, the city of Memphis, and its kind of sort of outlying area in Tennessee, is really the economic center not for other parts of Tennessee as much as for the Delta regions, the river Delta regions, but also the cultural Delta regions of Mississippi and Arkansas. In other words, the kind of flat areas alongside the river on both sides, extending 100 miles on both sides, depending on where you are. Right. Some people would categorize the Delta because Delta's a river mouth, it's going all the way down to Louisiana. I'm focused on the parts of it that are connected to Memphis. So it's the northern parts of the Delta that look to Memphis, basically. And that's a surprisingly diverse region. Its population included wealthy planters and industrialists, as you would expect, but also poor factory workers and farmers, Protestants, Catholics, Jews. Memphis was about 10% Catholic and 10% Jewish in the Depression. Of course, it's a region that's sort of known for its balance of black and white, but it also included a lot of immigrants and a lot of laborers who arrived to work on cotton farms and ended up doing other things. So this makes it in all kinds of ways an interesting case study. Right.
Okay. And you just talked briefly about the religious makeup, 10% in Memphis, 10% Jewish, 10% Catholic, the rest Protestant. Is that approximately what it looks like throughout the Delta region?
Well, the Delta was less Catholic and less Jewish, although it right. Not entirely absent, devoid of either. But in both Memphis and the Delta, power really centered in white Protestant churches. I call them the Protestant establishment because sort of standard characterizations of the mainline don't include, for instance, Baptists, but Southern Baptists had a lot of power in this particular region, whether you want to count them as mainline or not. So what I mean by the establishment are Episcopalians, Methodists, Baptists, Presbyterians, Disciples of Christ, and Congregationalists. And when I talk about the establishment, I'm really talking about white Protestants. There were middle-class Black Protestants who also had access to levers of power, but not to the political levers of power that the white Protestant establishment claimed. But it is, in addition to the Protestant establishment, there's a ton of religious energy and diversity in this region going pretty far back. So Baptists and Methodists dominate in both Black and white communities, are about 2/3 of altogether of both at least. But the Delta is also the birthplace of the Church of God in Christ, which was a small denomination in the 30s, but it was growing. It grew really fast, in fact, in the 1930s. And Memphis it was born in the Delta. Memphis is its denominational headquarters, and of course now that's one of the largest denominations in the world. So it's a much more, it is a really region with a clearly dominant Protestant establishment, but also a more religiously diverse region than I think we might expect.
Okay, fantastic. That's a great landscape you painted for us religiously for this area. So let's dive in. The book, in the first chapter, which is titled Depression Whipped, You provide great detail in describing what the Great Depression felt like in the years 1929 and 30. Can you help our listeners see this place, experience this place as they listen by sharing perhaps a few anecdotes and a summary?
Yeah, I'll do that. So, I spent a lot of time, I teach at Emory now, but I taught for 8 years at Mississippi State University, and I lived in the Delta, in the Arkansas part of the Delta out of college. So I spent a lot of time there. And when I was living in Mississippi, especially, and I was a historian, I'd get on an airplane to go to a conference. Starkville, Mississippi, where I lived, had one airport. All the planes came to Atlanta, and I'd sit next to somebody on a plane. They'd ask me what I worked on. Probably shouldn't have told them, but I did. And then it was kind of astonishing how frequently people who grew up in Mississippi would respond. So I say, "Oh yeah, I work on religion and the Depression, and Memphis in the Delta." They'd say, "Well, there wasn't really a depression in the Delta. People didn't really even know that they were poor." And I'm hearing this narrative over and over again from people I've just met. And then I'm getting off a plane to go to a conference where I'm going to talk about, or an archive where I'm going to sit and look at reports that show that 60% of Black children in Mississippi were living on 2/3 the minimum diet, that 25% of Black and white sharecroppers suffered from pellagra or rickets, which are both diseases of malnutrition. And that was in the 20s. These are reports from the 1920s when everything's supposed to be really great. It wasn't. There's actually an agricultural depression, but that's sort of a lost narrative, at least in a public sense as well. Scholars have talked about it. And if you were hungry, as clearly a lot of people were, there were really limited places that you could go. And a lot of listeners probably know, because of John Barry's wonderful book, Rising Tide, in 1927, there's a huge flood in the Mississippi River. The river floods the Delta, it fills it up like a bathtub, and it wipes out homes and farms and lives. And so in 1929, 1930, people are just starting to get on their feet again. And then, if you'll indulge me a minute, I'm gonna actually read a little bit of my description of that summer from the book, where we start in the beginning of the summer of 1930. The summer of 1930 brought a blazing sun, a cloudless sky, and months of dust and despair. Farmers poured sweat into earth that wasn't theirs, as if their bodies could quench the thirsty soil and nurture the stunted cotton plants. The great southern drought parched the earth from the Appalachians to the Ozarks, but it crouched longest over the Arkansas Delta, a flat expanse broken only by the Mississippi River and the low arched spine of Crowley's Ridge. That's a ridgeline in Arkansas. There the sun burned hot and long. The thermometer hit 113 degrees in July, and it stuck. Scattered clouds sometimes offered hope of rain, but instead evaporated into the hot, dry air. The cotton plants hunkered low, brittle, withered. Farmers who scraped for long days at the dusty fields found little more sustenance than the cotton they tended. Even those farmers whose landlords allowed them to garden could salvage only a few root vegetables protected beneath a layer of crumbling earth. Across the river in Mississippi, Coahoma County bluesman Son House sang, "It had been so dry you can make a powder house out of the world." And the drought proved explosive. No crop meant no income, and for sharecroppers whose labor proved unnecessary, no shelter for the coming winter. They would be actually kicked out of their homes. The year 1930 brought hunger. In August, people robbed a Pine Bluff, Arkansas store for provisions. In November, the largest banking system in the state failed, which meant that the few farmers who'd managed to save up for winter lost what they had in the bank. Nobody could buy anything on credit. The Red Cross stepped in to save livestock first, and then freed up a few resources for hungry families. But many of the planters who administered the aid deemed hunger a lesser evil than charity. By January, tens of thousands of Arkansans were starving. Black and white farmers outside the town of England took up arms and marched into town to demand food. Thousands of Delta refugees made their way to Memphis, where they hoped they might get a bowl of soup from the Salvation Army, but only if city officials didn't chase them out first. So that's what was happening in the summer of 1930. It's a devastating summer that follows a devastating decade. And so these food riots, which I write about more in the book, and which Nan Woodruff has also written about in a wonderful book called As Rare as Rain, the word of these food riots spread in the New York Times, and a New York Times reporter writes, "This is just, I didn't know farmers could starve. I thought they could just pluck the head off another chicken." There's really not an understanding outside this region that farmers aren't even really allowed to grow food. They're allowed to grow cotton because they aren't farming their own land. And so this idea that farmers who feed everyone else could themselves starve was something really jarring and pretty early so in public conversations. It turns out, you can't eat cotton and you can't make money on it when the drought wipes it out.
Right. Okay. Well, that's helpful to get that understanding of what it looked like economically there in this time period. Now let's turn to the churches. How did various religions in the region react to the Great Depression in its first few years?
Yeah. Well, I'm going to have to back up a little to answer that question and talk about kind of what the religious landscape looked like at this moment. So between the Civil War and the Great Depression, Protestant women's societies, and women were really much more central to this work than anyone else, by the way, and home missions organizations built schools, hospitals, orphanages, settlement houses, all of these to reach needy white people in the city of Memphis. And generally, those organizations prioritized their own members, although they were missional in structure, so they were happy to serve others that they could evangelize. More expansive Catholic and Jewish charities also served members of their own communities first, but they were more willing to help others without the sort of evangelism attached. By the 1920s, those organizations actually in Memphis and in a lot of other cities, this was a progressive era pattern, organized into a consolidated community fund that made it seem like anybody who needed help could only just ask. In fact, in Memphis, the community fund, as it was called, produced this brochure that said where to send people for help. And it listed all of the things that people could get from these city agencies. But all of those agencies focused on institutional aid. And it was the ethos of the community funds and of these private agencies was what we really don't want is to duplicate aid. Like the bigger problem isn't letting people go hungry, it's feeding people too much. Because if you provide too much, then you might spoil a willing worker, you might undermine people's drive to get things done. Goodwill Industries, which still exists in a different form today. In 1927, this is the year of the flood in Tennessee. The head of it, that's a Methodist organization, said, this is the head of a charity. So the first taste of charity is as dangerous as the first shot of dope. And that really reflected this kind of 1920s ethos of charity, right? Okay, we'll help people because there are people who deserve help. But really the task of a charity was to decide who was deserving and then provide the very minimum that they could provide to keep people from starving, although they did that quite ineffectively, without providing so much that they thought they would undermine people's willingness to work. Now, of course, this is also a disproportionately provided to white Southerners. Black churches, women's societies, and fraternal orders generally provided the only source of support for Black Americans in need. And there were Black charities that were part of the community fund. African Americans in Memphis paid more into charity than they got out of it. And that's not an uncommon pattern. Now, if you didn't need institutional aid, like if you needed to put your kid in an orphanage, there are orphanages. You might not really like what's happening there, but they exist. There are places for elderly people. There are places to go when you're sick. But families that faced chronic poverty or hunger had pretty much nowhere to go. In Memphis, the only place you could really go was the Salvation Army, other than informal aid from church or families. Now, a lot of the country had what was called outdoor relief, which is a kind of form of poor relief that was provided at a municipal level. And Memphis had a really minimal amount of that. The Delta had none. And by minimal, I mean like $1 a month. And its distribution was really limited. So people in the countryside relied entirely on informal aid or went hungry. In Memphis, they could go to the Salvation Army for the soup kitchen. This is before disaster strikes. Right. So suddenly, everybody knows somebody who's hungry, except apparently the Methodist bishop in Memphis at the time, who in 1930, he said, nobody's really starving in America. This was a month before the food riots in England, Arkansas. So it turns out maybe he didn't know someone who was starving, but a lot of people did. And a lot of people knew someone who needed help and they couldn't help them. And so it becomes very clear that not everyone who is poor has actually done something to deserve the poverty that they're experiencing. And so the narrative of helping only the deserving poor and figuring out who those are, which generally meant widows and orphans, and generally white ones, and those who passed all sorts of means tests. Suddenly, it seems like maybe the problem isn't only individual, but the problem is structural. Maybe there are systemic problems that are leading to this experience of poverty. Now, there are social gospel lawyers who have been saying this all along. There are lots of Black activists who have been saying this all along, who are pointing to structural injustice, but that's not really a part of a public conversation in the way that it becomes in the early years of the Depression. This is a moment that really changes the way even religious leaders start to talk about suffering, charity, and the language of individual responsibility here really changes to a language of corporate responsibility. What do we owe to each other? What do we owe to our religious communities, to our larger communities? So this is happening at the same time that religious and private aid organizations are saying, oh, we're really good at caring for people, though. And then suddenly there are three crises, right? The number of people who need help skyrockets. Donations plummet. And what's in the bank is gone in bank failures, which crush both farmers and the middle class. And then this defense that many of the poor deserve what's happening to them falls apart in the face of the environmental and economic crises that are so suddenly visible. So churches and charities did try to help. I mentioned the Salvation Army before. In December 1929, the Memphis Salvation Army had served 1,700 meals. The next winter, every month it served about 10 times that many.
Wow.
In that winter, the Salvation Army actually had a swimming pool. It drained the swimming pool and made pallets on the floor for homeless men and boys to sleep on the pool floor. That is one of the only agencies that wasn't cutting back. Most agencies are cutting back because they're losing money. And a lot of fraternal organizations, which are one of the main sources of support, especially for Black Southerners at this time, are falling apart at the same time because those are mutual aid organizations that depend on not everybody needing something at the same time. Suddenly everybody needs those resources at the same time, and there isn't enough. Churches are really struggling. They're struggling just to keep their doors open. Between 1929 and 1932, national income drops by more than 50%. Now, for about 2 years, until 1933, church giving actually held steady relative to national income. Now, that still means a 50% loss at the exact moment that church resources are most distressed. And then after that, church contributions dropped by more than national income. But the churches cut benevolent spending first. In 1931, the Southern Baptist Convention had this whole series of financial crises that were internally caused. And the president of the convention said in 1931, arguably the worst year of the Depression, he said, we're putting off the Lord's cause while we try to settle with our other creditors. So you see over and over the money running out and the churches turning their spending inward and not outward. So these claims about the church's ability to help are really falling apart. And then private aid basically just collapses entirely by 1931. And as they face the suffering in front of them and their inability to alleviate it, there's a new conversation too among religious leaders in the South and across the country. You hear a lot less talk about individual responsibility and charity. Suddenly, Southern Baptists are writing in the Mississippi Baptist Record and other papers about the failures of capitalism, about Americans' basic responsibilities to each other, and they're demanding a response from the federal government, which they see as the only source of any possible help.
Okay. Well, you shared a lot there, very helpful understanding of what religions were doing before and then how they reacted as the Depression set in. You told us a little bit about this, but maybe there's more. Can you tell us about religion's efforts to relieve suffering during the Great Depression in the Delta, their successes and their inadequacies? You touched on this a little bit, but are there anecdotes that you can share about successes they had and inadequacies that they faced?
Yeah, there are lots, but when I talk about a lot, and I can do that now because it's quite jarring, and it ties to a personal story. My grandfather died between when I wrote the dissertation and the book, and we had these family conversations about things that I hadn't known before about our family. And one of those things that I hadn't known before was that I knew I had these two great aunts who grew up in an orphanage, and they didn't really have much to do with the rest of the family. What I didn't know was why they were in an orphanage or what was going on. And what had happened was that my great-grandfather, my grandfather's dad, had 3 of his own children and 3 siblings. His mother was sick, and he had 6 people to take care of. This is in the 20s, and he couldn't feed all of them. So he had 2 siblings who he sent to his own siblings, who he sent to an orphanage so he could care for his own children. A 3rd sibling was too sick to go to the orphanage. And so his wife, my great-grandmother, was tasked with caring for her. This is, I grew up in rural Appalachia. This is in the mountains of North Carolina. And he goes to work in the feldspar mines. She's trying to take care of all the kids. She leaves the house one day. These are houses with open fire. She comes back, and that sibling had fallen into the open fire and died. And so I learned this story while I was learning all of these stories about the way that people kind of muddled through the Depression and the losses that they experienced, while I'm hearing people tell me that there's no real depression. And what I started to realize is that there are a lot of stories that we just don't tell because they feel shameful or they feel embarrassing. And the result are these rosier stories about the experience of the Depression. Like people just kind of pulled themselves up their bootstraps and went on. And the stories of the people who fell into a fire and died because there's no one to care for them are lost. So that for me, I had written about one of the major institutions that Protestant churches had, which are orphanages. And there are increasing numbers of people who are taking their children to orphanages, not because the children are orphans, but because the children are unable to feed their own children. And an orphanage is a place where you can take a child to be fed and adequately educated. And so parents are, especially white parents, are taking their children to orphanage. There's a lot more skepticism for good reason among Black families about orphanages, but there is a Black orphanage in Memphis, Tennessee, which early in the Depression had the matron of the orphanage. The orphanage wasn't up to code, hadn't been inspected, and the orphanage caught fire and burned. And in the ensuing investigation, they learned that the matron of the orphanage had punished children for minor disobedience by burning them with hot pokers and hitting them with shoes. And one of the children had responded by setting this fire. There was no room in the orphanage. There were children sleeping in a bathroom, and several young boys died in that bathroom, not of the fire, but because it became essentially an oven for them. And I was writing this, my own boys were about that. These are boys around between all under the age of 10. And that's kind of like the best version of the institutional aid that churches are providing. And orphanages are increasingly taxed. And so they're jamming people into places like bathrooms. There's the White Baptist Orphanage in Jackson, Mississippi, where an aunt goes to visit a child and discovers the child is covered in bruises. And it turns out that the administrator of the orphanage has beaten the child with a board until the board broke. And you have to really do something egregious in Mississippi to be taken to court for excessive corporal punishment, but he blamed the Catholic matron of the orphanage. So this is happening in these early years when there's all this stress on these institutions. You have kids in what are sort of carceral places, right? As kind of the best the churches can offer. By 1932 or 3, those aren't even that isn't available. Orphanages are turning kids away left and right because there is no more room in the bathroom to jam them in, no more room in the bunk beds. And so you take something that's already looking pretty rough and even that is gone. So it's a pretty graphic example, but it's one that it just wasn't that uncommon an experience in this period.
Thank you for sharing that personal story. Now, churches, synagogues, being poor is something they've addressed for generations, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
How did the language change? Like if one were to go to church in these years in the Delta, what you touched on this briefly, but how were they talking about it now? Do you know? any of your research reveal things pastors were saying?
Well, I think what's really striking is I don't have as many sermons as I'd like, but in the sermons that I was able to read from this period, what's happening in the pulpit isn't changing a ton. And in fact, there's this kind of period at the same time that everything is falling apart. There's this period of what I call in the book stunned agony, where people are really hurting, and what's happening in the pulpits is really kind of just ordinary business. And churches are, they're trying to like gather more coats, but they are really not able to help people in the way they would like. And also churches tend to concentrate people of the same race and class categories, right? So if a church with some people in need is generally a church with almost everybody in need. And when everyone needs something at once, it's a lot harder to help. So the language in sermons isn't changing. What is actually changing is the language in religious publications and the kinds of things people are demanding of their churches. So like the Mississippi Baptist Record has this editor, D.B. Rollins, who goes from talking a lot about individual responsibility to talking a lot about the failures of capitalism and the way in which the capitalist system had especially kind of like he talks about the sort of money interests and that sort of thing, and in ways that are sometimes touch on anti-Semitic. Like it's not all like something rosy as to celebrate, but there's this emphasis on the failures of capitalism as a systemic problem that has created poverty that then the public is responsible for addressing because it is a result of those failures rather than of failures of an individual. So that language is just, I said that earlier, but that shift in language is really quite dramatic. And you have Mississippi Baptists talking about socialism as like the very best possible way out. And it's not uncommon. It's not just sort of these guys over on the edge. It's a real wrestling with a recognition that the systems that are functioning in people's daily lives are not functioning, and that something has to change. So there is this sort of bubbling up of like a popular kind of socialism in this moment. It's not widespread, but it's not uncommon either.
Yeah, I do remember reading about that in the book. So now let's move towards to religious bodies' reactions to FDR's New Deal programs as they spread across the Delta, and note any changes as time went on. Allison, if you could, for our listeners.
Sure. Yeah. So I'll start with the early response. And, for a time, the demand for response comes when Hoover is in office, and Hoover's response is basically a series of loans that are required to be repaid. So Roosevelt is sort of sweeps into office in just an extraordinary fashion, and begins to sign the barrage of legislation known as the First 100 Days in 1933. And the program I talk about most in the book is the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, which was the first program to put federal funds not only towards employment relief, which had precedent, but towards direct aid for the suffering in whatever form city and state administrators of that aid saw fit. All this New Deal aid is administered at the city and state level, which is the way it gets passed, but also the way that that Southern Jim Crow manages to keep hold. Most often, Southern cities went for food and jobs aid rather than direct aid being money. But FARA was unique in that, relative to programs before it, it actually prohibited explicit racial discrimination. Local administrators found other proxies for racial exclusion by reclassifying workers or classifying Black and white workers who are doing the same work into different categories. But it actually took a lot of sort of wrangling in the early days of FARA to figure out how to maintain Jim Crow under this program. So federal aid quickly outpaced all private agency aid in dramatic fashion because it could leverage a vastly larger pool of resources, right? So across the nation, but especially in places like Memphis and the Delta that had offered very little, New Deal spending just makes everything else before it look like pocket change. So at the beginning of private giving in 1931, residents of Memphis had raised 88 cents per person in community aid, going in large part to these institutions I talked about before. 75 cents of that 88 cents was private. By 1934, with the New Deal in full swing, Memphians received $7.21 per capita in aid for either direct or work relief, and only 12 cents of that 721 was private. So you see the dramatic increase in public aid, and private aid is still decreasing because, again, these are agencies that have really been completely either destroyed or undermined by the Depression. So in just 5 years, then, federal dollars provided the work and food that Memphians needed, and private aid drops from 3/4 of relief spending in the city to less than 2%. In the Delta, all aid pretty much at this point is public. So it's easy then to take a narrative, and like Franklin Graham did this for a while in the early aughts, and I probably still does, to say the state just swept in and took over the work of the churches. But the thing is, the churches had stopped doing this work before the state came in, and the limited aid that they'd offered before the Depression was gone. So what happens is New Deal programs shift the emphasis from individual suffering to collective responsibility. So it's not just a shift in aid, it's a shift in the language that accompanies that aid, from private charity to public welfare. And the idea that the public, that the government, that the state is responsible for some degree of a social safety net is an idea that really gets a real toehold, really becomes an important idea during the Great Depression. Now, none of the aid I've just described is actually a safety net. This is emergency aid, and that comes later. But even this early aid, it gets just acclaim from liberal Protestants. You mentioned the way in which churches has talked about poverty for centuries. Protestants, Catholics, and Jews all have language around poverty and the importance of care for the poor. And so liberal Protestants especially applaud the Federal Emergency Relief Administration and the National Recovery Administration, which acknowledges workers' rights to organize, as a realization of the social creed of the churches, which is the statement published in 1908 by the Federal Council of Churches. And Catholics linked the New Deal programs to papal decrees regarding social justice and workers' rights. Jews talk about the connection between the New Deal and teachings of ancient Israel's prophets. So you see these programs that a lot of religious leaders have actually been calling for a long time. That call expands dramatically in the early years of the Depression. And then you see religious leaders saying, well, finally, someone is listening to us. Not the state has taken this from us, but like we've been asking for this all along. And you get a lot of enthusiasm in this period from Southern white conservative Protestants too. The National Bible Press actually publishes charts that track the biblical allusions in Roosevelt's speeches. This Mississippi Methodist editor that I mentioned before, in response to the NRA logo, a blue eagle, said, "The blue eagles perched on my door. I've signed up for the war against the Depression." Right? They see this not as something that's taken from them, but is actually something that they have helped to create.
I do remember that's a strong thread in your book, and I appreciate, I think our listeners appreciate you bringing that to the fore and pulling on it a little bit to help us better understand what was going on with religion, poverty in the Depression. We are talking with Dr. Allison Collis Green, Associate Professor of American Religious History at Candler School of Theology at Emory University, and author of No Depression in Heaven, The Great Depression, the New Deal, and the Transformation of Religion in the Delta. Listeners, be sure to follow us wherever you get your podcasts. Allison, we are going to do an entire podcast episode, as you know, about FDR's 1935 clergy letters. But can you briefly explain what this is and what we learned from the respondents in the Delta?
I can, yeah. So FERA and the 1933 programs that I talked about curbed the crisis. There's this narrative, it's in every U.S. history class, apparently, because all of my students come in with it, that the New Deal didn't end the Depression, the World War II ended the Depression. And the New Deal didn't end the Depression, although the parts of World War II that the World War II government programs that ended the Depression came out of the New Deal, but whatever. What the New Deal did do was actually stop the slide, right? So it certainly did a lot. But none of these programs so far represented any kind of permanent safety net. Like I said, these are all emergency programs. And so there is really a demand on the part of religious leaders, on the part of public figures like Huey Long and others, Father Coughlin, to establish something that looked more like a permanent welfare state. And Roosevelt responded to those demands in 1935 by signing the Social Security Act, which made provisions for the elderly, the orphaned, and the disabled. and then establishing the Works Progress Administration, which eventually created public works jobs for 8.5 million Americans. And so when those two programs pass, Roosevelt, and he borrows this idea from the governor of Wisconsin at the time, actually borrows like most of the text of the letter. He writes this letter to all of the clergy in the nation to assess their responses to the extension of a permanent federal safety net. Now, this is like a fairly obvious effort to gain public support for what he's doing, but it is also an effort to figure out kind of what people on the ground are thinking. And so he follows like the Federal Council of Churches listing of churches, and he also posts this letter in newspapers so that pastors who aren't in this listing are able to see this and respond. And over 30,000 clergy in the nation eventually respond with letters to Roosevelt's letter. And because the New Deal administration counted everything, they counted the responses and they tabulated levels of agreement with the New Deal in those responses. Now, these are New Deal administrators doing the counting, right? So they could certainly count things in Roosevelt's favor, and to some degree they did. But it's the letters are labeled with how they counted, and they're fairly accurate. Of the first 12,000 replies, 84% either entirely or mostly approved of the programs of the New Deal. Now, and again, this is also a selective group in that you're getting people who responded to the letter. But clergy wrote over and over that the welfare state represented a religious achievement instead of an encroachment on the church's work, that it freed them to focus on supplementary care or return to a focus on evangelism. Remember, the churches are going broke trying to help people. So this is a relief in a lot of ways for a lot of pastors. There are pastors who write and they include lists of people in their congregation who have very specific ailments because they want Roosevelt to help, because they have this really new way of thinking about the role of the federal government that, oh, hey, this actually is like important in my daily life and in the daily lives of my congregants. And if this person needs a new set of crutches, I can write to the president and ask for that. Now, there are people who disagree, of course. Premillennialists included Roosevelt among many possible antichrists. He was like fourth on the list. And a lot of white Southern conservatives increasingly began to worry, and you see this in these letters, and it expands later. You asked about later responses to the New Deal, that the New Deal will undermine the work of Jim Crow capitalism. So, we have a lot of really good history on the way that the New Deal helped to create white wealth, and it certainly did. But it didn't do so. That wasn't inevitable, and it didn't do so uniformly or universally. The New Deal administration was also a place that Black pastors would write to as actually more frequently than white pastors, and list the needs of members of their churches. Black farmers would write to members of the administration to ask for relief from the encroachment of white farmers, even as you have federal programs that are exacerbating that problem. And you have this sense on the part of a lot of Black Southerners that now there's recourse. When there's an injustice, there's somewhere else to go. And white Southerners also have this sense, and the white Southerners who are trying to maintain the white supremacist structure in the region, particularly the hold on economics, are able to do that in part through their hold on the administration of aid. But they see the New Deal as a threat to Jim Crow. They think that they can manage the levers of power in ways that allows the New Deal to reinforce Jim Crow, and to some degree they do that, but they feel it as a threat. And so you have this growing reaction to the New Deal, and there are a lot of historians who've written in a lot of ways about where that comes from, this reaction to the growing government. But I see it happening in the South in particular, is that reaction is really based on the sense that the New Deal is a threat to Jim Crow. Whether it is or not, and that's it both is and is not. That is the sense that you see on the part of a lot of these conservative Christians, and that narrative, but increases over time. And there are also African Americans who are saying, like, this administration, this aid administration is really racist. Like, the New Deal is actually making things worse. So there are ways that the New Deal is kind of changing the way that people in the region understood where they could access power. Christian and Jewish socialists are really unhappy with the New Deal. They're a small but visible presence even in the South, because they wanted a president who would unmake American capitalism, not reinforce and revive it, which is actually what the New Deal was about. So there are a range of protests against the New Deal, and you see those in the letters. Again, they're a minority of the comments. And then, of course, there are clergy who begin to worry that the federal government is weakening the church's hold on Americans by strengthening secular community institutions, and not religious ones, which weren't funded in the same way by taxpayer dollars.
How prominent was that concern in the letters?
In the letters that I have from Memphis and the Delta, it isn't.
Right.
Matt Sutton has written about letters in different regions. So has Randall Stevens, who I believe is part of the next podcast. And what they have found is actually quite different from what I've found, which is that complaint is much more significant. But in Memphis and the Delta in 1935 and 1936, that's just not the primary concern. It's in a few letters, but it's by no means dominant.
Okay, fair enough. Allison, in your New Religious Alliances chapter, you mentioned some very interesting efforts indeed. Can you share some of the most intriguing and talk about their significance?
Yeah, I'll talk about two, I think. And neither of these is an alliance of which I am the only or primary historian, but I'm trying to tell their story through this narrative of the Depression. So there are really wonderful historians, for instance, of the Southern Tenant Farmers Union, which is an interracial farmers union that organizes in Arkansas and then spreads in the 1930s. And the Southern Tenant Farmers Union it's a sort of this interesting collaboration between Christian socialists and local farmers, where it intersects in a lot of ways with the New Deal, but where it intersects most significantly with the New Deal is that it's a response in part to the Agricultural Adjustment Act, which basically allowed white planters to so the AAA pays farmers not to plant things, right? And so white planters take the money from the AAA. They're supposed to share it with their sharecroppers. They don't. They take the money and then they kick off their sharecroppers. So sharecroppers are getting kicked off farms, and the plantation situation that they lived on was really horrifically abusive anyway. And now they're losing any kind of toehold that they had. So they organized to protest the AAA, along with a lot of Christian socialists who see this as and it is one of the programs that does the most to buttress the large agricultural interests. And in response, the federal government creates, not only in response to the Southern Tenant Farmers Union, but also in response to other protests, it creates the Farm Security Administration, the Resettlement Administration, and then that becomes the Farm Security Administration, which creates some resettlement communities for farmers who are displaced from tenant farms, for farmers who are displaced from the Dust Bowl. My colleague, John Ebel, who I believe you're talking to at some point, has written about those camps in California. I wrote about one of them in Arkansas, which was a place where some of the members of the Southern Tenant Farmers Union hope to land. There are also private cooperative farms, although these are cooperatively farmed. The Delta and Providence cooperative farms, which are Christian socialists' efforts. So you get interesting alliances of the Christian left with poor farmers on the one hand. One of the other alliances that's totally unrelated, that's really interesting, is that the Church of God in Christ in the Delta in this period is not at all engaged in the start of the Great Depression with any kind of federal programs. But there's this woman who Anthea Butler has written about beautifully. Her name is Irenia Mallory, and Irenia Mallory was grew up Baptist, became a really important figure in the Church of God in Christ. She organizes a school, and she takes students from the school across the country fundraising for the church. She also becomes friends with Mary McLeod Bethune, and in doing that, she actually becomes part of the NCNW, the National Conference of Negro Women, and actually starts to engage with the New Deal administration. So this is another instance where, on the one hand, you have New Deal programs that are expanding white access to wealth, but you also have a New Deal administration that is open for the first time, not only to sort of the Black middle class, but also to people who like Irene Mallory, members of the Church of God in Christ, who previously really had very little relationship with the federal government.
Right. Well, those are fascinating connections there and stories. So thanks for sharing some of those. Allison, you mentioned the Resettlement Administration and their view of Pentecostals as, quote, institutionally and individually unstable, putting a fragile new community at risk, close quote. What was going on here?
Well, let me say first that I just chaired a book panel that discussed the books of John Ebel and Lloyd Barba, From Dust They Came and Sowing the Sacred, respectively, both of which address this question much more directly than I do.
Okay.
But the Resettlement Administration is basically a modernizing project, right? This isn't some sort of charity for poor farmers, although it is a place for displaced farmers to go. The idea is to teach people to be better farmers, to provide a place where they can learn to be modern. CCC camps did the same kind of work. A lot of the National Youth Administration did a lot of the same work. This is one of the projects of the New Deal, is to introduce modernity, particularly to rural people, and to modernize in that sense. So for the administrators of Resettlement Administration camps, Pentecostalism and any sort of what they perceive to be emotional or ecstatic religious practice is primitive and reactionary, not modern. And so they don't want what they perceive to be primitive and reactionary to contaminate their modernizing project. They see them as at odds instead of working in cooperation. There's this I think my favorite story in the book reflects this in part. There's this woman, Anna Lane, who is recruiting families for a resettlement project. And she goes to visit this family. She has to wade through the mud, and she goes to visit this family in their home. And on the mantle of their house, she sees two wooden crosses, and in the middle, this painting of a child. And it seems fairly obvious that maybe they've lost a child or something. And on the crosses are the words sorrow and adversity. And she basically makes, as a condition of their acceptance into resettlement, and she uses pseudonyms, so I don't know if they were accepted. She makes them promise to reverse the crosses and write love and joy instead of sorrow and adversity. And in her mind, right, this is part of the modernizing project. This is part of looking forward and not backward. But it is remarkable the degree to which New Deal administrators describe themselves as doing the work of the state, but the work they were doing was actually quite theological, and they were prioritizing certain kinds of theologies, those theologies they saw as modern and forward-looking, over those that they saw as backward-looking or primitive or reactionary. And Pentecostals were kind of like the poster people for that characteristic.
I'll need to definitely read those books and get those two on a podcast. That seems to be a very fascinating story and important one. Allison, you write that, quote, the religious organizations and ideals Christian reformers often argued must lead the way to build a better South. The New Deal reversed those priorities by opening new options to Southern Christian activists and allowing them to put their ideas to work as agents of the federal government, close quote. How significant is this?
It's important in that it reflects the degree to which activists were able to say, I can change the world around me, not only by exercising levers of power through my church, which I will say they found repeatedly frustrating, or through parachurch organizations, which has long precedent, but they could say, actually, I could do this as part of the federal government. And they brought with them, like in the case of the Resettlement Administration administrators, they brought with them those values and priorities that came out of their churches, a sense of what kind of theology is acceptable, which tended to be a kind of mainstream Protestant theology. And they brought with them also the same set of priorities that they had advocated for to begin with, those reflected in the social creed of the churches. So the work not only of Protestants, too, this is a New Deal administration that actually, for the first time, is a federal administration that welcomes Catholics and Jews in its ranks. You see people whose work is for and on behalf of the secular and the public, but also very much informed by the theologies in which they were raised and trained. And so the narratives that we have now of a kind of discontinuity between the work of the church and the work of the state, right? This is a disestablished state, are important narratives, but the people who are doing this work actually saw a lot of continuity. And so I think that in that sense, it's important, right? That's the sort of theological importance of it. And then in a structural sense, it's important because it does reflect, sort of contra what I've just said, a shift from the power of the church to make change to the power of the state to do that, and people's sense of that, the state as the locus of change. And Irenia Mallory, who I mentioned before, is a good exemplar of that. She remains working within the church, but suddenly she sees that it's also useful to have access to the state.
Okay, thank you. Let's jump to the Baptist Joint Committee, which we chatted about briefly before. Tell us the story. So the Baptist Joint Committee is active today. It's a fairly influential and prominent religious freedom advocacy group. Has headquarters in Washington, D.C. Tell us the story of how they came to be.
I will say first, this is only a partial story. There are other origin narratives for the Baptist Joint Committee, but one of them is in a kind of watchdog role in relationship to the New Deal, and that this was a collaborative effort to some degree on the part of Northern and Southern Baptists, American Baptists and Southern Baptists, and then the part of National Baptist, which is the largest Black Baptist convention. And the central concerns are twofold. One is a question about whether public dollars will or should be used for denominational schools. For Baptists in this period, the answer is no, because if they are, then the federal government might also have a say about what happens in those schools. And then the second concern is about whether clergy will have to be part of Social Security. So the policies around Social Security change over time, but in its first iteration, churches are exempt from the requirements of Social Security, and Southern Baptists have just created this pension fund that they're real excited about. It's actually pretty lousy, but it was what they had, and they didn't want to lose that. So they organized in 1939. There's a congresswoman in New York who wants to bring churches into the Social Security Act, and Southern Baptists protest. They say it would make the church subservient to the state. The measure fails, but that year, the Northern Baptist, the American Baptist, Southern Baptist, and the National Baptist released a joint statement for the first time ever called the American Baptist Bill of Rights, and it called for absolute religious liberty, renewed a call for separation of church and state. Said that Baptists feared that their denominational leaders had abandoned that priority, that value, with the arrival of the New Deal. And this came out of some collaboration that began in 1937 around questions of religious freedom among Northern and Southern Baptists. And then in 42, as a result of the same kind of concern about Social Security and denominational schools, then you get the formation of the Joint Conference Committee on Public Relations, which is an antecedent to the Baptist Joint Committee, which, by the way, does really wonderful work. But its origins were in part in this kind of watchdog role and sort of like came out of some self-concern.
Right. Well, that was a neat thing to read about. I'm familiar with that organization, and I didn't know it's at least this origin story. Two last questions, Allison. First, in your epilogue, you write, quote, "Instead of driving people to the churches, the Great Depression drove the churches to the state," close quote. You've talked about this a bit. This seems to me, at least, a major finding from your research. Can you give us sort of a final summary statement on this finding and elaborate on anything you feel important?
Yeah, I think what I can probably do best is just briefly summarize some of the things I've already said in one place, which is basically that church leaders at the same time took credit for the New Deal. Like Social Security seemed especially to be a realization of a lot of social gospel efforts in line with Catholic social teaching, and for Jews lived out a lot of the demands of the prophets of ancient Israel. And at the same time, church leaders, they took credit for the New Deal, but they also blamed the New Deal for some of the things that they felt they were losing at the same time. A lot of church leaders thought it would be great if they could get back to other work, supplementary work to the state, but others wanted to be distributors of that aid, that it would allow them to if they could distribute aid, then they could maintain the kind of moral authority they'd always exerted in determining who deserved help and who should actually receive aid, right? Back to this question of the deserving poor. Harry Hopkins, who administered FDRs, and had expressly forbidden any overlap between church and state in the administration of New Deal programs, although there were ways to apply for an exception. So Catholic Charities, for instance, becomes one of the exceptions. It can distribute federal aid. And there are other exceptions as well. That's sort of where my story ends in terms of the federal aid piece of it. But Axel Schaefer has this wonderful book called Piety and Public Funding, which is about, from World War II all the way up to the present, the way that conservatives came to embrace federal money as its distributors, particularly via churches and church agencies, and even before faith-based aid, even as they sort of publicly complained about it. And so this is a dynamic that does really come out of the New Deal, the sort of taking credit for the good things that come out of federal aid, but complaining about the existence of it at the same time, that it's somehow rendering people dependent, and the churches can make it better if they just have a hand in it, but then not really admitting when they do.
Right. Understood. Okay. Last question, most important question. As we conclude, do you want to share any lessons or takeaways from the book, either in terms of important historical transformations you were charting, or in terms of helping us better understand our present moment today in the American narrative?
Yeah. I'll end with what I usually use as kind of a starting point in talking about the book, which is this frame that appears both in the introduction and the epilogue, which I call the myth of the redemptive depression. This is basically the argument that the depression really wasn't that bad. People didn't starve or suffer, that federal intervention really just made people dependent. And it's a really persistent narrative, like the one that the New Deal really didn't have an effect on the depression, that it was the war. The problem is that, in part because the active intervention of white Southern churches and politicians, New Deal programs actually disproportionately benefited white Americans. That wasn't an inevitable outcome of an expanded federal safety net. But that's never part of the narrative of the myth of the redemptive depression, right? It's that the federal government came in and it took over things that it shouldn't have. And now we have people who are dependent on the state, even though in matter of fact, really the federal safety net, to the degree that we still have one, which is not extensive, came much later in the war on poverty and not from the New Deal. Really, Social Security is the only version of that from the New Deal. But for decades, the New Deal consensus thrived. And from the 40s to the 60s, Republican and Democratic administrations expanded the welfare state. They fought for it to protect more American citizens than the New Deal had done. When civil rights activists protested the unequal benefits the welfare state provided to whites, Lyndon Johnson's administration responded with the war on poverty. These programs were complicated and not all good or successful, but they were designed to expand provisions for health and child welfare across lines of race and ethnicity. And Again, it was an imperfect effort, met with fierce resistance, but it did represent the most equitable expansion of the welfare state. And sort of was a statement that this was possible, that there are ways that you can create a federal state that does increase rather than diminish equity, that distributes wealth, which is a controversial term still, wasn't actually in the Depression. But conservative repression of the civil rights movement and a backlash against federal protection for all Americans was already underway, and it really depended on this narrative, this myth of the redemptive depression, the idea that people really would have been fine on their own, that nobody was really poor, that nobody really suffered, that Roosevelt just kind of mucked everything up. And by the 80s, the war on poverty really sort of shifted into what became the war on the poor under, in part, Reagan's leadership, which is a renewed effort to blame the poor for their own suffering and deny them the exact services that had actually proven an effective road out of poverty. So it took 4 decades after the New Deal of these efforts to shrink and privatize the welfare state while expanding its punitive powers, right? The means testing increases with like welfare to work and that kind of thing, and erasing its efforts to close the gaps between rich and poor, between black and white, between immigrant and citizen, between men and women. And what's happened after those 4 decades is this new period of income inequality. And when I wrote this book, I would say unmatched even by the 1920s. The book came out in 2016, and now I have to say our wealth distribution in 2023 makes even the Gilded Age look equitable by comparison, right? It's increased just the wealth inequality just that much since 2016. And that work to dismantle the welfare state only works when you recast the narrative of the Great Depression. You erase the stories of suffering and of hurt and of sorrow and of this really kind of collective effort, if only for this one ephemeral moment, to address those things, and instead repackage this economic crisis as something somehow redemptive. It taught people how to push through poverty, and that myth, I think, underscores and buttresses this kind of contemporary faith a lot of Americans express in the voluntary and private sectors, and a really kind of widespread skepticism of the federal government that doesn't say, oh, here are problems in the federal government that we should address or rectify, but the federal government itself, its existence, is the problem. And again, that language has only, I think, intensified since I wrote the book. The sort of example of characterizing the government as a problem, when I started the book, you could always talk about, Reagan talking about making the government so small you could drown it in a bathtub, or the I'm from the government, I'm here to help kind of trope. But now that kind of narrative has buttressed a much stronger reaction against the federal government to the point of people actually advocating for its complete dismantling. So I think the kinds of stories we tell about our hard times have a whole lot of power over the way we live into the next ones.
What's the role of religion in this story of this myth of redemptive suffering that you?
Yeah, I would say the role of religion is twofold. One, right? Religion is always a part of myth making. And so in the sort of broad, diffuse sense of religion, it's always there. But in a more specific sense, the role of religion is that churches are really most often used as the kind of foil to the work of the government. The government took it from the state, is the language that Franklin Graham, for instance, has used. The idea that if the government weren't in the way, more people would go to church. The Great Depression would have led to this, would have led to this great revival. That it's the federal government that really stands in the way, especially of the work of the church. And so there's that rather than in the characterization of New Deal advocates, there's this separation yet partnership, that instead there's only animosity and antagonism between church and state.
Okay, you have the last word. Thank you for that. We have been talking with Dr. Allison Collis Green, Associate Professor of American Religious History at Candler School of Theology at Emory University, and author of No Depression in Heaven, The Great Depression, the New Deal, and the Transformation of Religion in the Delta. Listeners, follow us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon, or wherever you get your podcasts. And if you enjoyed this episode, please write a glowing review. Allison, fantastic. Thank you for being with us and helping us comprehend the American project better by understanding how religion, fueled by the idea of religious freedom as found in the U.S. Constitution, engaged with the Great Depression. It was informative and enlightening, and I hope you enjoyed the time with us as well.
Yeah, it's been a lot of fun. Thank you, Chris.
The podcast series Religion in the American Experience is a project of the National Museum of American Religion. Episodes will be released monthly on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts.